Hello, AP US History class. It is I, Mr. Shalou, back for another rousing teacher discussion of now Chapter 25. We are in the midst of World War II. This is probably my favorite topic to discuss, and I hate the fact that we are not currently in school. This is such a visual type of discussion. There's lots of things that I'd like to show you video wise, and I really hate that we have to do this over YouTube. So I will provide some links in Classroom, things that I'd like you to watch, discuss. Really, this is a topic that needs to be kind of a group discussion more than just me sharing information. I will do the best that I can to walk you through this PowerPoint. But if you have not engaged in like other material for World War II, you really need to immerse yourself to really understand how serious of a situation America and really the world as a whole was going through during this period. Especially coming off of the heels of the Great Depression, we were already in a very vulnerable position, and like the future of civilization was at its meeting point, at its make or break point, I guess. Um, Today, I'm going to start talking about the background which led to conflict. You cannot talk about America's participation in World War II without first backing up to global history topics and talking about what mainly Europe and the rest of the world were going throughout the Great Depression era. So really starting in the 1920s, but we're going to focus mainly on what was happening in Europe and in Asia in the 1930s. So this first section is going to be looking at what led to the authoritarian regimes, which caused conflicts leading to World War II. First, I want to start with the Soviet Union. So this actually goes back to World War I, and when Russia drops out of the war because of its Bolshevik Revolution, well, the Bolsheviks end up taking control, and Russia is going to be reconstituted into the Soviet Union. So Vladimir Lenin, is going to create this Soviet Russia. It is his leadership that creates this new Soviet communist style of government control and authority over everything. Well, he dies in 1924, and it's a kind of a power vacuum because originally it was a triumvirate. It was Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and this guy right here, Joseph Stalin. So Stalin is eventually going to be able to consolidate power. It takes him a few years, and he is going to be much more of an authoritarian than Lenin ever was. Lenin was a true believer in communist ideology. Stalin used communism to grab power and really be the first absolute dictator that is going to kind of control this period. In his vision of communism, the Communist Party, is going to control pretty much all aspects of people's lives through the government intervention. Citizens had to obey every directive the government was provided without question. Anyone that challenged the authority of the government just simply by questioning a decision made would be severely punished. There were a number of ways to punish the people within the Soviet Union. Mainly, there was just immediate assassination, like you would be killed on the spot through execution, or probably the more painful, I don't know if it's more painful or less painful than dying, but being sent to the gulags. And hopefully you talked about that with Mrs. Kanik last year in Global. But these were re-education camps that were set up, labor camps in the most remote areas of the Soviet Union, Siberia, thousands of miles away from civilization, in order to be re-educated. And these places were absolute atrocities. Like just being able to survive a few weeks was considered a victory if you were sent to the gulags in Siberia. Stalin used this reign of terror to his advantage by making sure he could silence all of his political foes, even in the military, not just in the government. And this is going to come back to bite him in World War II. He's going to have a lot of military problems, mainly because he got rid of all of his military experts. He was incredibly paranoid. And he thought that anybody that had kind of a just ability to work normally, somebody that was competent in their job, was a threat to him. So the by the time World War II comes around, most of the Soviet leadership is pretty inept. And that's definitely going to cause issues within the Soviet Union for the first years of this war. Then we turn to this guy right here, Benito Mussolini. So Italy is going to be traumatized by World War One. They were technically on the winning side, but their economy is going to collapse very early on, and Benito Mussolini is going to take over control of the government in 1922. So he is not a communist. This guy right here is known for fascism. And fascism is this hyper extreme nationalism using military and like blind loyalty to the state, to the government and its citizenry. And the idea behind fascism is this hyper form of nationalism that your country is not only the best country in the world, but you have to prove that you're better by building up this military, by basically crushing all opposition, that your way is the only way of thinking, and anybody that has a different way of thinking than you is automatically wrong and needs to be punished for that. So Mussolini is going to kind of take on the persona of the old Roman Empire. He believes that the modern Italian state in 1922 needs to return to its Roman Empire roots, that Italians were cheated by the results of the Treaty of Versailles and the World War I, that Italy was needing to return to its Roman Empire roots in order to establish itself as a modern progressive country. So once he was able to take over power, he was a prime minister. He wasn't a dictator right away. He was given the reins to the leadership of his government because his party won a majority. And from that point, he immediately started banning all political parties, going through the legal process to attain more and more power. He controlled the press, making sure that schools would be re-educated so that his philosophies were the only things that were allowed to be taught in schools, that other opposition would be completely eliminated. Punishments, like in the Soviet Union, were pretty severe. Anybody that didn't adhere to the fascist ideology would be either outcast from society or would be much more brutally punished, even fatally punished. Now, to prove that his government and his way was superior, he felt that empires need to build, so that he went out and he wanted to gain more territory and more influence in the world. And so he looked to Africa to do this. There was one independent country in all of the African continent, and that was Ethiopia. And so he decided that in 1935 he would invade Ethiopia. And it wasn't really a fair fight with modern technologies that the Italian military had built up. Was going up. It was kind of like a David versus Goliath situation against Ethiopia. You're talking horses and muskets from the 1800s versus tanks, planes, machine guns. And the League of Nations did very little to even intervene, even though this international organization was trying to make sure that conflict would not continue in the world. They did very little, and France and Britain refused to even get involved in the situation. So Ethiopia was basically left out to dry. Italy is going to take over this territory as conquered. The authoritarian regime that most people point to when they're looking at World War II is Nazi Germany. They're looking at this guy right here, Adolf Hitler. So I know that Mrs. Canick spent a good deal of time talking about the rise of Nazism in Germany and how Hitler was able to come to power. But just as a quick refresher, Hitler was involved in World War I. He was a soldier, he was a younger individual, and he became very disillusioned with how the power structure of German government really let the people down. And he blamed a lot of the loss of Germany in World War I to the power structure. But he also blamed the Jewish faith, the people adherents of Judaism. So he used Jews as a scapegoat for why Germany had been weakened, why they lost the war, and why their international prestige had kind of fallen off the charts. So the ideology here that that Hitler is going to come up with is not a new concept. There had been this anti-Semitism, this anti-Jewish rhetoric for centuries. This is something that goes back to really the fight between Christianity and Judaism for almost 2,000 years at this point. So why does he kind of piggyback onto this anti-Semitism rhetoric, and why does he blame the Jews for the loss for the Germans? Well, it's because the economy starts tanking, and he connects the Jewish people with money. It's not completely out of left field why he would think that. Throughout the Middle Ages and when the Roman Catholic Church kind of dominated society throughout most of like the 1400s, really up to the 1800s, the Roman Catholic Church refused to allow people to borrow or to lend out money. So basically, anybody that was a Christian was not allowed to be involved in the banking system. So because Christians weren't allowed to be involved in the banking system, this was taken up by people of the Jewish faith. And so throughout the 15, 16, 1700s, you see the major banking outposts in Germany are going to be, or not just Germany, but all of Europe, really. A lot of the banking structure, the banking systems are going to be controlled by Jews because they're the only ones allowed to do that in a Christian-dominated society. So that anti-Semitism is going to come back to why the Jews were able to control the money system and why there wasn't enough money to fund World War I. Now, it's not, this has been disproven. It had nothing to do with how much money was being lent out by banks, but it really didn't matter to Hitler because the German people wanted to blame somebody for why they lost. They couldn't just say they lost because the other side was stronger, better, had more capabilities. They needed to come up with a reason, a rationale, and it's always easier to blame somebody else than to blame ourselves for failure. So it was an easy target. The Jewish faith typically controlled the money supply in Europe through the banking system. So it was their lack of funding that led to the defeat in World War I, which is why Hitler is going to jump on this scapegoat bandwagon, using them for all of the problems that Germany is going to experience in the 1920s. His public speaking skills were probably the best of any of these authoritarians. He was really on par with FDR when it came to being able to reach the public. It's not that Germany all of a sudden became super racist and wanted to target one specific group. It's that Hitler was very charismatic. And he was able to kind of draw the attention of people that had been suffering tremendously from the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, people that felt defeated as if the German culture had been completely destroyed by the war. They wanted a pick-me-up. They wanted somebody to tell them that it wasn't their fault, that that things would improve, and somebody that would take actions that were necessary to get the country back in good graces. In desperate times, people are willing to sacrifice personal freedoms, civil liberties, in order to get back to where they think they belong. Human nature, we're very fickle beasts. We're people that would rather be protecting ourselves first and foremost before the general population. And so Hitler fed into the fear of people not being able to have and continue the existence that they once had. So by kind of reaching people on this level, this psychological level, he was able to gain a lot of support. And so through his National Socialist Party, a fascist party very similar to what Mussolini was creating in Italy, the Nazi Party was able to win a majority of the Germany seats as the country was falling into severe depression. So in 1933, the same year that FDR comes to power in America, you have a very different way of trying to handle the Great Depression, this worldwide depression that was involved. Hitler, like Mussolini, was not an authoritarian dictator to start out. He was democratically elected to his position as Chancellor of Germany. Within a couple of years, by 1935, he will have assumed all of the dictator powers in the same way that the other authoritarians did, by just legally getting rid of the other political parties, taking on more and more control as time went on. Controlling the press, making sure that the schools were taught only his ideology, and controlling this religion of people, actually non-religion. He was very atheist. So he didn't really kind of play on the he didn't play off of the Christian stereotypes. He was secular in his beliefs. What made him so charismatic as a leader was he would hold these grand celebrations, Nazi rallies. And you can kind of see a picture there in Nuremberg in 1934. He would have these huge support celebrations, talking about the glory of Germany and how the German Reich would be superior to all other civilizations, that he saw himself as a new world empire that he was going to build using the German people. And he actually referred to Germany as the Third Reich. The First Reich would be the Roman Empire, the first global empire, at least in the eyes of Europeans. The second European empire, global empire, was the Napoleonic Empire that was referred to as the Second Reich. So this Third Reich would be the Nazi empire that he was trying to create. So like I said, there was this massive attack on Jewish faith, that this anti-Semitism was kind of pushing the agenda of the Nazis, where if things were going wrong, it was clearly the fault of the Jewish people. He would single them out as the cause of all possible problems, economic problems, social problems. And so to kind of feed into the rest of the German population, he started creating more and more limitations for the Jewish faith within the Germanic Empire. First depriving them of the citizenship, then they couldn't use public facilities, then they couldn't work in certain industries, they had to register with the government, they had to wear a Star of David to identify who they were at all times. And so really this is the beginning of what is eventually going to become the Holocaust, which is the final solution to the mass genocide of the Jewish faith. That is going to not really kind of kick into gear until the late 30s, and really doesn't become what we see as the Holocaust until the 1940s. It is not all one thing that starts. This is a stepping stone type of situation where they start off small, and then over time, as things continue on, they take a little bit more, they take a little bit more, they take a little bit more. It's kind of like that book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. Give a mouse a cookie, it'll ask for a glass of milk. You give it a glass of milk, he'll probably want a napkin to wash his face off. I've read that book to my 5-year-old daughter, and you can see the parallels between that mouse and Adolf Hitler. He takes one freedom away, and when that is socially accepted as a society, then he takes another freedom away, and he keeps moving forward because nobody's there to stop him. And that's going to lead up to this mass genocide of the Holocaust, which takes place during the middle and end stages of World War II. So why does the German society put up with this anti-Semitism, this extreme belief in authoritarianism? And the answer is Hitler is effective. He does what he says he's going to do. He fixes the economy. Now, he does this by remilitarizing Germany. He creates all of these new jobs and new construction projects by re-triggering the German war machine. Reversing all of the previous decisions that were made under the Treaty of Versailles, ignoring the League of Nations, and without anybody really wanting to go to war, the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, they're still feeling the effects of World War I. And so nobody wants to fight. And so when Germany starts violating these actions, like no other country steps in to tell them to stop. The League of Nations is toothless in being able to enforce its policies. So again, going back to that book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, like Germany starts rearming the Rhineland. They start rearming their military. They start pushing the envelope with pushing the border more and more outward, taking over more and more territory that was lost at the end of World War I. And in every situation, like Hitler takes an action, he waits for a response. There is no response, and so he moves on to the next action. And we call this appeasement. The countries are appeasing Germany, mainly because they might have been a little bit too harsh with the Treaty of Versailles, but also they're just not willing to risk going to another global war in order to satisfy the demands of Nazi Germany. So you have these authoritarians. You have Hitler in Germany. You have Mussolini in Italy. You have Stalin in the Soviet Union. And they all kind of take on this one way of handling the economic depression that is going on. They see that complete control within the government is what is necessary to get the country back in social and economic order. Now, this is not 100% far off from what FDR was doing in the United States. Now, I'm not trying to say that FDR was an authoritarian, but it's really very interesting how the New Deal programs pushed the envelope of government intervention in people's lives. With more and more government control of creating jobs, of taking over industries, of creating regulation in businesses, like that is government control. That is forms of authoritarianism, of socialism. And so even though FDR is not considered a authoritarian dictator in the sense that Mussolini or Hitler or Stalin were, the government was involved in authoritarian actions. You need to understand that when you have desperate situations like a Great Depression, you have to handle those situations by any means necessary. So America was kind of involved in similar situations than what you saw with other authoritarian regimes. Now, one of the striking differences that you have between FDR and these other authoritarians is that FDR is not blaming one group. It's not scapegoating a specific group compared to these other individuals. Like, he's saying that this is a problem and it needs to be overcome, and the government will take any action it needs to help that situation. You don't see that with the fascism, the Nazism, and the Soviet philosophies. One other group that we need to discuss because they are going to play a major role in American involvement in World War II is Japan. So Japan was one of the major victors in World War I. They were part of the Allied side. They had acquired all of these German and Austro-Hungarian territories in the Pacific, but the Depression is going to greatly impact the island of Japan. So Japan doesn't have a lot of resources. They kind of rely on other places around the world to kind of support their, not just their infrastructure, but the population. So as Japan was suffering through the Depression with no end in sight, the leadership of the Japanese government was acting too slow, kind of like how Herbert Hoover was not taking enough actions when America first fell into the Depression. So with people growing impatient with the democratic government, the military leaders took over control of the country. They acted in a martial law situation where they would invade other countries for raw materials in order to industrialize. The areas that were kind of a big deal were Manchuria, which was a northeastern part of China. It was first invaded in 1931 for coal iron deposits. So this became a Japanese colony after 1931. The Chinese requested the League of Nations to intervene, that this was an illegal act. You can't just invade another country to steal their resources. The League of Nations didn't do anything. They gave them a slap on the wrist and said, don't do that. And Japan simply left the League of Nations as a protest. Oh, you don't want us to do this? Well, we'll just leave. And again, because the League of Nations didn't have any way to enforce their policies, Japan was able to get away with this. So where does that leave us? The United States, because of the way the end of World War I worked out with the Treaty of Versailles, we were isolationist with the rest of the world outside of Latin America. So throughout the 1920s and throughout the 30s, as these regimes were taking over control in their respective countries, America was dead set on America first, this domestic policy of fixing the problems within our own country and kind of ignoring what was happening in the rest of the world. Not because we were oblivious or ignorant of what was happening, but simply we felt that it was more important to focus on ourselves and fixing the economic, social problems of our own country rather than looking out at the rest of the world. So as it became more and more obvious that these new authoritarian regimes were invading other countries, taking over more and more control, causing conflict, it became apparent that war was kind of on the horizon once again. And America did not want to get involved in some sort of conflict so soon after the Great War, especially with the way that the war ended. So Congress is going to pass a series of laws in the 1930s known as the Neutrality Acts, keeping us out of any potential conflict in Europe or Asia, banning the sale of arms and loans to the nations that would possibly be at war, warning Americans not to travel to countries that were on the brink of war, just to kind of protect ourselves against what possibly happened at the end of World War, or at the beginning of World War I. At the same time, we're going to try to do whatever we can to improve the relations here in the Americas with Latin America. We are going to be much more heavily economically involved and less much militarily involved in the countries of Latin America, treating them more like good neighbors and less like Big Brother always watching over them. We try to strengthen our ties within the Western Hemisphere, essentially. Okay, and that's where I'm going to leave off with this video. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that everything's going well. Please email if you ever have any questions, and I will talk to you again soon.